Welcome to the fifth and final plenary session of the Translation and Transmission Conference. We have the opportunity to discuss both translation and transmission, and moreover, a very broad topic with quite provocative opportunities for discussion in terms of authenticity and myth-making. And so over the course of the past few months, we've had the opportunity to carry on an ongoing digital conversation, and it's been fascinating to see how these topics have developed with their interactions with each other. And so my hope for today is that as we progress through each speaker's presentation, we'll have some time at the end for them to address the question to each other and thus initiate a dialogue between the panel before moving to questions at the very end of the session. Just in case you don't know everybody up here, I'll just give a very brief introduction, but of course we can refer to our packets for their full list of accomplishments and contributions. So first today is Wulstan Fletcher, who's a Tsadra Foundation Fellow. Next is Karma Lekshe Tsomo, who is a professor at the University of San Diego. Don Lopez is professor at University of Michigan. And Jules Levinson is with the UMA Institute for Tibetan Studies. All of the panelists asked me to thank first and foremost Tsadra Foundation, Eric and Andrea, for putting this on and inviting us here. We'd also like to thank the steering committee, especially Marcus, again, for all the work that he's done to put together a conference that clearly is just a grand slam hit out of the park. It's been an incredible privilege to be here. And then finally, the panel also specifically asked to thank all of the various support staff that have helped us put on this conference. From my perspective anyway, it's been completely seamless, which is just testament to the incredible array of hard work that's gone into providing this context for us. And with that, my name is Dan Hirschberg. I'm an assistant professor at University of Mary Washington and a member of the Natarta Translation Network. And Wulstan, would you please begin?
Okay. Good morning, everybody. I'll have to speak quickly because I've got quite a bit to say before we have the question and answers. In this meeting between the people coming from the traditional practice-based Buddhist community and the academic community, I suppose it's normal that the academics have been the most voluble and articulate on the various problems. That's their job. But what I've been hearing is that quite a lot of academics have been saying or giving the impression that they consider themselves to be practitioner scholars. In other words, the boundaries between these two communities are starting to break down, which is good news. Especially if by practitioner one means somebody who submits to the tradition and receives the teachings of the tradition and practices within it, rather than it might just mean maybe that one has come out to one's colleagues that one believes or one is a Buddhist or so on. So there is this kind of crossover that's going on. But what I would like to do now is to distinguish these two communities and point out how they remain different, and in a way how they should remain different. And so taking up the theme, the title of the panel, which is to do with myth-making, I wanted to introduce an idea of myth, which I find quite useful. And this is a quotation from the English philosopher Mary Midgley, who is quite old now, but still alive, and spent most of her life teaching in the University of Newcastle. And this is from her book called The Myths We Live By. And she says, "We are accustomed to think of myths as the opposite of science, but in fact they are an essential part of it, the part that decides its significance in our lives, so we very much need to understand them. Myths are not lies, nor are they detached stories. They are imaginative patterns, networks of powerful symbols that suggest particular ways of interpreting the world. They shape its meaning. Our imaginative visions are central to understanding of the world. They are not a distraction from our serious thinking, but a necessary part of it. There is nothing wrong with the fact that our imagination plays a part in shaping our worldview. We need it to do so, but we also need to notice how it is doing it. So, taking up this idea, I would say that there are two myths. There is a myth associated with Tibetan Buddhism, and a myth associated with the academic enterprise. And by myth, obviously, I'm not talking about something as if it were untrue. It's a way of thinking about the world. And when we look at Tibetan Buddhism, it is a complete and integral tradition that miraculously has remained so to the modern age. And it is thanks to the Tibetans that we have a living tradition of Buddhism here. I mean, of course, there are other Buddhists, but as far as we're concerned. Now, an integral part of the myth, in inverted commas, of Tibetan Buddhism concerns the translation of the Sanskrit scriptures. And at least in the Nyingma school, we think, or we say, that the translations that were produced in the two diffusions, mainly the first diffusion, are perfect. They are definitive. They totally replace their Sanskrit originals, which for the most part are no longer accessible, and they weren't accessible to the Tibetans. They were perfect and definitive. There's no need to do the job again. And this idea, I suggest, is based on the notion, also part of the myth, which is common to what was common in medieval Europe, that languages don't evolve, that they remain static, and therefore a translation that is perfect becomes definitive. It can't be improved on ever. It is on the basis of this idea that we have the Lung transmission, that the Lung is passed from Sanskrit into Tibetan, and because the Tibetan translation will not change, the Lung goes with it. I'll come back to this later. Now, looking on the academic side, the academic approach to life also is based on a myth, which is grounded in the scientific attitude to life, modern scientific attitude to life, which has certain assumptions which are usually not questioned. They are that there is such a thing as objective truth, that truth exists independently of, I mean, I know this is starting to change, but until now, the idea was that truth remains true, regardless of who is thinking it or talking about it. Not only that, but through the practice of reason and the individual rigor, one can arrive at this objective truth. Also, the scientific method in which the academic study of Buddhism is based has a strong element of materialism. That is to say, it excludes anything that is not directly observable to third parties, which naturally leads to a skepticism of anything that is outside that framework. So in the academic study of Buddhism, there is a natural skepticism towards anything in the Tibetan tradition on the preternatural side. Now, speaking for myself, I grew up, I grew old in the practice tradition. I was drawn to that, and I wanted to practice, and I wanted to emulate the great teachers that I met. And actually, just to bring the two sides together, it became particularly clear to me when I was working on the translation of the Bodhicharyavatara of Shantideva, which, though translated in Tibetan, exists still in a Sanskrit form. I know that it's not an undisputed Sanskrit form, but it's there. And of course, the Sanskrit or the Sanskrit texts, there are all sorts of critical questions that one could ask about the integrity of the Sanskrit embedded in Prajna Karamati's Panjika. But anyway, the point was that I felt that since the Tibetan tradition is living even now, it is in the Tibetan tradition that the transmission of the Buddha Dharma subsists, passed from generation to generation of people who have, in the case of Shantideva, have embodied those teachings and have proved their truth by their experience, not through reason, but through experience. And therefore, it seemed to me that although the Sanskrit text was available, it seemed to me proper to make the translation of Shantideva based on the Tibetan translation, which to me is kind of ratified and sanctified, if you like, by these generations of people who have realized its meaning. Of course, there are other translations that are based on the Sanskrit, which are very valuable and very interesting. But it seems to me that the transmission of Shantideva as a living tradition is in the Tibetan. If you look at the Sanskrit, if you want to read the Sanskrit, if you want to adopt the academic approach, the scientific approach, which is the study of texts, the study of history, the study of anthropology and so on, you can build up an enormous body of knowledge about it. But the knowledge of it is elsewhere. Of course, you can have people who do both, and that's wonderful. But the question is, what happens when there are conflicts between these two worldviews? And this is actually a crux that we have arrived at. I have no answer to this. So, for instance, as I said, the basis of yeah, I'm coming. The basis of yes, the basis of the Tibetan textual tradition is based on this idea that the translation is definitive, right? But as translators, we all know that this is not true. There is no such thing as a definitive translation for the simple reason that languages evolve. And that even if at one point you can argue that the translation is perfect, generations or centuries later, it will no longer be so because people don't speak that way and they don't understand the same words, the words in the same way. And of course, when you know something, you can't pretend that you don't know it. You can't sort of adopt an obscurantist view and say, I believe, the King James Version was good enough for Jesus, so it's good enough for me. You can't adopt that kind of attitude. And on the other hand, for people coming from the academic point of view, you will. I would suggest that the conflict is bound to arise, and what will happen, if it hasn't already happened, for people, academics who are practitioners, there will be the kind of conflict that happened in the Catholic Church at the end of the 19th century in what was known as the modernist crisis, and that's something we could maybe talk about later. But so. My dear colleagues, what do you think?
Well, I guess I'll speak on behalf of the academics. And since we're at a translation conference, I've been wondering what the Tibetan is for these various terms that we use. And I would assume that when you use the term academic, you don't mean keba, pandita. You probably mean dogewa. Tarkika. Sophist.
Well,
and I guess I would dispute the idea that academics believe that there's an objective truth. I think that I'll speak on behalf of the entire academy here, do feel that there is value in history, and much can be learned from history. And so we can say from the historical perspective that Shakyamuni Buddha did not teach the Mahayana Sutras. Shakyamuni Buddha did not teach the Tantras. Rinpoche did not dictate and bury the dare. Now, if I were to say that Shakyamuni Buddha did not teach the Mahayana Sutras, I would have broken a bodhisattva vow. So that's the crux.
Yeah.
It is the case, however, that when we look historically, every great Mahayana Pandita, from Nagarjuna to the demise of Buddhism in India, 1,200 years later, included in any Shastra that he wrote a defense of the Mahayana as the word of the Buddha. which means that throughout the history of Buddhism in India, there were people saying they are not. And perhaps the majority of monks in India thought that. And so what do we make of that defensiveness? And I think that defensiveness, which we see in all the texts, is something that we have to come to grips with as we talk about this idea of myth.
Mm. But then what do we do about that?
Well, I think that one can accept, or there's a situation in which one can accept the historical fact, if we want to call it that the Buddha did not teach those things and that Guru Rinpoche did not bury those texts. And at the same time, not diminish one iota the power and importance and inspirational quality of those works. And so I guess my plea is that we not abandon our historical consciousness that has been won with such difficulty, and that we use that to somehow enhance our practice.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. But wouldn't it be necessary somehow to evolve a kind of way of looking at this, like to say that, and maybe you won't agree with this either, that the basic premises of the Mahayana are implicit in the words of the Buddha, and eventually they...
Which ones?
Well, I don't know. You had to be... that they can be traced back to what Shakyamuni said. I mean, this is...
We don't know what he said, right? I mean, that's the problem, that nothing was written down for 4 centuries after his death. And therefore, we're taking this received tradition, which is the power of transmission that you're talking about. And that's what we have to understand, and not worry about whether the Buddha said it or not.
Are you absolutely certain of your premises?
I would say that I'm representing the consensus of the sophists. Yeah, right, yeah.
But you see, if you look at it from the traditional point of view, where instead of from yourself looking, sort of going back straight to the origin and judging it according to your understanding and your premises, the Tibetans, and in any religious tradition, you go back generation.
Right.
And one of the things that actually attracted me to Buddha Dharma was that it's not a religion of the book. And it's not a dogmatic system. And that the bottom line, the ratification of the truth of the Dharma, is that it works. And that it has this power to transform. For me, that is the only thing that I need, actually. And the rest is an amusing reflection. But, that's my position. And that actually, at the same time, I don't think that... at the same time, I am extremely interested in the academy and what the academy is finding, and I respect it very much. Nevertheless, I don't know how to articulate. On the one hand, there's what the head understands, and there's on the other hand what the heart understands. And in the end, what inspired me to enter the Dharma was seeing people who were so much better than I was, so greater than I was, and they attained that based on a worldview that I am prepared to entertain for that reason. So when you say Guru Rinpoche didn't bury the treasures, actually he didn't bury the treasures, mostly. The whole doctrine of the Terma is a bit more subtle than that. When you meet a Tibetan, you know that they're not frauds, they're not tricksters. They haven't made it up. I mean, I find it impossible to think that they made it up. And
but many were called frauds and tricksters by their own fellow Tibetans.
But not everybody. Right? There are ways of discerning authentic Tibetans from false ones. So, yeah, I don't have answers. I'm just asking questions. Yeah.
Again, I don't think we have to call all Tibetans frauds.
No.
And it's not.
But if they're not
based on-
frauds, what happens? That's the...
Well, it's the effect of the text that they reveal, however they reveal it, and wherever it comes from.
Yeah.
That's what's important, not where it came out of the ground or not.
Absolutely, but the attitude, the skeptical attitude of the academy has a corrosive effect, and it can undermine the faith of the person who might be helped by such a thing. I mean, when I was a Catholic and studying as a Catholic, I saw so often people who, theologians who had spent years studying, and they had discovered all sorts of inconvenient facts. And so they kept their mouth shut because they would have been punished or thrown out. But that didn't bother me so much. What bothered me was that they reached the end of their lives and they were empty-handed. They had nothing. They didn't believe anything. They had nothing. There was nothing that everything had sort of fallen apart for them, and it seemed a very miserable conclusion to me. So
I'll just finish by saying I think that's an extreme. That is, one can acknowledge these things we've been talking about and not die empty-handed.
Yeah.
Well, another way of looking at it is that all academics don't speak with one voice. There are many different opinions and perspectives in the academy. And I mean, we do recognize that the seeds of the Mahayana are contained in the earliest strata of texts. I mean, compassion, the six perfections are part and parcel of the early tradition. So these things may have developed later, but I would say that the seeds of much of Mahayana philosophy are contained in the early texts. And also that while we respect the historical critical method because it sheds a great deal of light on some mysteries that otherwise are difficult to untangle, the critical method is also found within the Buddhist tradition. In fact, it's part and parcel of the tradition. We're not only allowed but obligated to analyze the texts and teachings minutely. Certain concepts may not, like karma may not be, or rebirth may not be questioned, but we do. And that's allowed. And so I think that's built into the tradition.
Thank you.
Do we have one more minute?
Please.
Well, I think what this engaging conversation, especially between Wulstan and Don, is prompting for me is a sense of finding ourselves at a moment in history when there's a collision of many, many different perspectives. It's not just between a traditional Buddhist outlook and the academic way of proceeding, but as became vividly manifest for me at a conference I attended in Bangkok a few years ago, where there were representatives of many different Asian traditions. It's sort of what I had thought was the case theoretically, I think turned out to be true in fact, which was that they've not been in conversation with one another for a long time, and now they can't avoid it any longer. So the collision between, for most of us here, Tibetan Buddhist tradition and at least some, strange within the academy, is just one among many. Mm. And what interests me is to see how they're going to affect each other. And part of what you are expressing a concern over is a concern for me as well, is how will the authority of the academy possibly corrode the authority of Buddhist tradition. But I'm also curious what goes in the other direction. What effect will Buddhist tradition of many different sorts have upon everything going on in the conversations in the academy? I have trouble believing that these things aren't going to influence one another. And so obviously instead of an answer, I'm just offering a lot of bigger questions and trying to put it in a...
That's great. Thank you, Jules. Thank you all for your discussion. This is a good way to lead into Lekshe's discussion of some of these tensions that are confronted.
Yes, the question I would like to pose is, or explore, is what are the limits of tolerance and responsibility in translating demeaning passages in the texts and the narratives and the commentaries, whether they concern race or gender or disabilities or sexual diversity or other social justice issues. So this is challenging myths from a different perspective. The myth that men and women are equal in Buddhism, the myth that never a drop of blood has been shed in the name of Buddhism, in the face of massive evidence to the contrary. So as a Malibu surfer and a Berkeley activist, and I come at this from a different perspective perhaps, but also as a contemplative and an academic, an erstwhile academic. Okay, so this question has been gnawing at me for maybe 4 decades. And in full disclosure, I was one of those wide-eyed kids at the Tibetan library who just was so thrilled to encounter the Dharma that we just absorbed it like sponges and rarely questioned some of the disparities, like the illiteracy of, of most of the women, for example. And when we look at these charts on the back of the room, I mean, it's so awe-inspiring. But we can see that the early translators and transmitters of tradition were almost exclusively male. That's a matter of historical fact. And it's very heartwarming to see that in recent history, some women translators and transmitters of tradition have emerged. So myth busting, but and so we really need to pay tribute to people like Anne Klein and Betsy Knauper and Karen Lang and Sarah Harding and so many, Janet Gautso and so many who have helped to break through some imagined barriers in terms of gender. But of course the question applies across all of these social justice issues, and this is the kinds of questions I would like to raise. The systematic exclusion of women from the institutions of higher learning in the Tibetan tradition, even though now we've established around the edges some, catch-up institutions, but still the majority of the greatest masters are of course in the major monastic institutions, and women have no access to those institutions. So this sort of runs parallel to political and economic disparities in other traditions around the world. And we know that with the incidence of sexual discrimination and sexual violence around the world today, this is an issue that really needs to be taken up. So there's tremendous resistance in many Buddhist communities to this kind of, to having this discussion. And we need to question why there is so much resistance, what factors are at work here. So going back to the texts here, we can look at some of the messages that are sent through the texts. And in regard to women, I particularly focused on women, but we could do the same with race and disabilities and heteronormativity and so forth with no problem at all. And the images of women that are put forth. So what do we do when we're translating these texts? Perhaps in terms of textual transmission, we can deal with it in a footnote. But what do we do when we're on the mic? Does there come a time when we simply set down the mic and say, I won't participate in this? So I'm sure that many of us have been in this position perhaps numerous times. Is it enough to deal with it in a footnote or a kitchen conversation? Or maybe isn't it time that we dealt with it straightforwardly? Okay, where it really came to light in Dharamsala when I was a student was with Ayadeva Shigyalpa, the 400 stanzas on the middle way, and where women were likened to to toilets and sewers. And I mean, it was kind of a wake-up call for us. Yeah. Gee. And of course, the justification that these teachings were being given primarily to monks, but then that has its own problematic, right? And why the disgusting nature of the human body is almost exclusively portrayed in terms of the female body and so on. So then I'm just showing some positive images of women throughout the years and contemporary images too as a kind of background for this topic. So how did it happen that almost all of the translators and transmitters of tradition throughout 2,500 years of history are male? Is that simply an accident, or are there other factors at work? And another very cogent argument for inclusion here is the need for qualified teachers throughout the world. 1 billion Chinese, 1 billion Indians, I mean Tibetans in Manchukuo. We need teachers badly, and to exclude or ignore the potential of women as teachers would be really short-sighted. So I think we need to get with the program here. Of course, you know, all of these, the way women are treated is humbling, but it can also be really demoralizing to work for 2 years to bring His Holiness to your town, and then when it comes to breakfast, to be treated like something the dog dragged in. I mean, there's something not okay about this, and we need to look at it. What do we do when we're interpreting in front of an audience? How do we handle this skillfully? The question of skillful means, and so on. We're in the midst of a cultural shift globally, and it's a time when we really have power to help with social transformation. And as translators, as teachers, we really do have enormous power to help to shape a more just and compassionate society. So I would urge that we, you know, recognize the potential that we have to create a more just society. Now, we heard about the story of Shariputra. It's not as if this is an isolated incident, the Shi Gyalpo or the Sherab Dongpo or some of these. These images are throughout the texts and commentaries, and it's not an isolated incident. And so if every translation is indeed an interpretation, then language reflects the lens through which we view not only the text, but the society in which we live. So some of these conventions that have been accepted unquestioningly for millennia, I think now it's time that we need to call them into question. And I hope that you will join in this effort. Now, some may say that's not my job. I just work here. And I mean, we've all said that, but maybe there's more to it. Maybe we need to broaden our perspective and look at our role within the historical context at this pivotal moment in history. Need to be aware of the blind spots and the critical role that we play today in society, because people are looking to Buddhism. They're looking to Buddhism for an alternative to the kinds of hypocrisy that they find in some of the other traditions. And so we have an opportunity here, a golden opportunity, and I hope that we won't throw it away. So, in fact, I hope we won't participate in perpetuating some of these traditions or, bad habits. I mean, monks are kushala, reverent, and nuns are anti. I mean, this is very disparaging, and it's not the first time in history that women have been treated like this, but the fact that it continues even today, that people will refer to women who have dedicated their entire life to Buddhist practice as anti is simply inappropriate. So I know this is like spitting in the wind. I've been on this for 3 decades and nobody's listening, but I hope that as translators, you see, we have the kind of power to shape the tradition in very positive ways. So that's what I have to start out with.
Would you like to pose a specific question to the panel?
Oh, I had something here. My question. how can we as translators and transmitters foster social inclusiveness? I mean, again, what are the limits of tolerance and responsibility in this work that we do?
So I guess I'm taking some of those passages that you had up, those misogynist passages that you had on the screen. How would you suggest that those be translated?
Well, that's exactly the crunch. You know, how, that's why I'm asking the question. I mean, is it ethical to translate them in using inclusive language? I mean, that's what brackets are for, right? I mean, the female or male body is like a sewer. I mean, if we wish. But I mean, it would apply to both as far as I understand. So, because we also have to consider the ethics of saying nothing, what I call passive karma. I mean, isn't there also, silence is also powerful. And to let these passages stand without question is also, I think, unethical.
But there's also something you can do. I mean, you're very articulate about it, but there's also one can resist this, what you've been talking about, perhaps more passively, perhaps less bravely, I suppose. I live with someone who is she's not as articulate as you are, but she is without concessions when it comes to so-called masculine superiority, and we had a case to decide upon when we were asked by a Lama to translate a certain prayer, which about being born in Sukhavati, and you know, in Sukhavati there are no women, right? And the commentary on it had long passages which denigrated women, and so the answer is no, we're not going to translate it. It's better that it's not translated, because after all, when you translate something, you're translating for a target audience, and the target audience certainly doesn't need that message. So even if it's supposedly traditional, there's no reason why it should be continued. So there's that attitude. But the other thing is that when we explained this to the Lama who wanted us to do it, he said, "Oh yes, well, that's just your Western take on things. But if you were a Chinese woman, or if you were, you know, a woman in Afghanistan, you might well wish not to be reborn as a woman." So, I mean, it was a point of view. But obviously, that's not something that should affect the way we work with regard to our own society. Because after all, our own societies will affect other societies in the world. Yeah, so that's just it.
Well, I respect your decision, and I also respect all perspectives. It's it's a personal choice.
I mean, we avoid gender. What's the word? Gender restrictive terminology when we can.
Yes.
But it's not English. It's not easy in the English language.
Right. Right, exactly. Maybe easier than in some European languages, in fact.
It is, yes. Yeah.
Terms have to be gendered, and we're running into that problem in translation too. But this is one really positive role that the Academy can play, because we're licensed to challenge everything. And so we can challenge. We could translate that text and then write a commentary that challenges every assumption that's embedded within it, which would be a positive contribution. Right? And the myth, again, coming back to our theme of, being born a woman is bad karma, or the result of bad karma. They don't usually say the result. They say that being a woman is bad karma. And that is, of course, affects women in very unfortunate ways. It's led to, this is not past history. This is ongoing in almost every Buddhist society. And therefore, I think that there's really a place for challenging the things up front, including, I mean, because it doesn't make sense. If an enlightened being manifests a Pure Land, an enlightened being can be either male or female, since there's no gender in the nature of the mind, then it doesn't make any sense at all that the Pure Land should be exclusively male, right? So, I mean, we can also use our critical thinking skills to.
But don't we have to translate what the text says?
Yes, but we can also include challenges, even in the written text. And maybe footnotes are better than endnotes, as someone suggested, because it's right. We can challenge it right there on the page.
Yeah.
A couple of miscellaneous things. One, I think encouraged by having been taught when I was able to study Shantideva and his terrible things he said about a woman's body and so forth, that said, I was told, whether this would normally have been said or not, I don't know, but I was told, well, please remember, he's speaking to men, and you should consider that if he were speaking to women, if one was speaking to women, something of the same order would be said. It wasn't meant to defend necessarily that kind of outlook. I took that to mean, the point was for me, I took it to mean that when I was working with other teachers on other texts, I could pose that perspective, propose that to them, and probably end up doing pretty much what Wulstan decided, which is if they wouldn't let me do that, I would just say, thank you, but I'm not going to translate this text or this passage, which doesn't really answer Don's legitimate challenge at all. But then, for me at least, the question then sort of enlarges into not just the matter of translation, but the kinds of traditions we are furthering and perpetuating and creating. And I end up thinking about it kind of in two ways. One is in terms of what, if anything, I or someone in my position would do to affect the further evolution of Tibetan cultural traditions. And I sort of think, not much. I mean, it's not really anything I can do a whole lot about. But then as you were speaking, I was reminded vividly of something a friend told me about a long conversation she had with Jigim Trungpa Rinpoche, and something that Trungpa Rinpoche said when I was translating for him at the Shambhala Mountain Center in 1990. And to make this as brief as I can, a friend told me about just railing, against this to Trungpa Rinpoche, just really letting him have it, this and that and the other. And reading those passages, my heart sinks. I mean, it's really discouraging. And he just sat and listened and listened and listened and listened and listened. And at the end of, she told me, she said, I must have been going on for an hour and a half, He just said, you're right. That's how it was. And now the future's up to us. And the other has remained as a kind of total enigma for me. I don't know what to make of it, but it's such an odd story. I was translating for Trungpa Rinpoche, and he was teaching a rather large crowd of people. And there was a tanka up sort of to his left of the lineage of the Karmakagya, from Dorje Chung through Telo, Naro, and so on. Almost entirely men. And someone said in questions, Rinpoche, how come there's no women up there? And he looked over his shoulder at this thing as if he hadn't noticed it, And he sort of went like this. And he turned back and said, oh, them. It was just like, he said, well, it's just a kind of sign of people who held certain major responsibility. And he said the oddest thing, he said, Hajan Kalchambo Mare. he said they weren't really all that important. You know, as if there were so many others.
Well,
And
it
I
may
would-
not be important when you're in a position of privilege.
Yeah.
And this is the problem, that people in positions of privilege do not notice these things. And the same thing happened once when, Sylvia Wetzel pointed out to His Holiness the almost exclusively male imagery in Tibetan monasteries. And I mean, he almost cried because he'd never noticed it before.
Yep.
And so I think this is why we need gender training, not only in Tibetan monasteries and institutions, but also in American Dharma centers. Because sometimes the greatest discrimination I experience is in Western Dharma centers, not in Tibet, not necessarily in Tibetan or Chinese or, Thai society. It's everywhere, but we don't recognize it, especially when we're in positions of privilege. And not noticing that women didn't have access to full ordination, for example, or the fact that Tibetan nuns even today are being told that they don't need it. Why should you need it? Because you're just a nun. And these kinds of attitudes, which are extremely discouraging, because in order to do the work that we need to do to transform society today, we need all the help we can get. We need these women. And education is confidence. We need to support them, include them, and encourage them, right? And so we need to notice.
I'm sorry. The next line I was going to say might have been important to the story,
Okay?
which is that as he said a little bit about it, I think he would agree, and I would certainly agree. Not that my opinion strikes me as terribly important, frankly, but that what he was trying to say, but he said, Shenda Hajang Mambuyori. He said there were so many others. And I was too stunned at the moment and too timid to invite him to say more about that. But I never have had an opportunity to ask him further, but what he seemed to be gesturing at was that this was just such a meager representation of what the tradition understood. That does not in any way diminish.
The message is
Yeah,
however.
diminish the need to change the visual representation, obviously. Yeah. But to him, I was so interested in his saying there have been so many others, men and women involved in the tradition of practice and teaching. That's what really, and that I didn't know anything about it.
Right, but often women have been invisible. I don't think that we can deny that. And the numbers were definitely smaller, and the positions or rank that they held and the opportunities that they had were definitely less. And I don't think that we can rewrite that history. I agree that the future is in our hands, and that's why I dare to mention these uncomfortable issues, right?
Well, so there we are in between.
As much time as we have for that one, I think.
Yeah.
But thank you so much for raising these issues, and I look forward to Yes, Don.
So before I begin, I wanted to apologize to everyone for forcing you to schlep a 5-pound black doorstop back home. If you have to pay any excess baggage allowance, I will make sure that it's paid by Robert Buswell for you. People were talking yesterday about translation being a labor of love. Compiling a dictionary is not a labor of love. In fact, the one false statement that we put in the dictionary, much to the chagrin of the press, was a sentence in the section on the hells, which said that in our research we discovered an additional unknown hell, the hell of the dictionary compiler, in which just when you think you've finished and written that last entry and checked the kanji and the Sanskrit diacritics, you find one more entry that needs to be written. And that goes on for several nayutas of kotis of kalpas. It was 12 years, but I would say more seriously that this is a book that we did in part for translators. Someone called it an industrial strength dictionary of Buddhism, one that is not really meant for the general public, but for scholars and practitioners, and something that perhaps the public might aspire to have all the words that they need, not to leave things out. I mean, as many, the 1.2 million words that you need, of course, there are many more. And so we really did do this, I think, in some ways for you, and I hope that you can put it to good use. That's our prayer. And it's also the first academic dictionary of Buddhism that gives full account and recognition of the Tibetan tradition. And the many historical entries, biographical and about monasteries and so forth, most of those are written by Andy Quintman, who's here today. So I want to acknowledge Andy for doing all that good work. This was all done before Treasury of Lives was even anybody's idea. Treasury of Lives is done by Alex Gardner, who I'm also proud to say is my student. So anyway, that's just a little preface. My question for the group is, when we think about issues of authenticity and mythology, what resources do we have from the Tibetan tradition ourselves that we can draw from to address these questions? And in thinking about that question, it occurred to me that if I had to do over again, it might have been nice, instead of giving you this big black dictionary, to give everybody a copy of Genny Trimbell's Damgyu Serki Tangma, translated as Grains of Gold by the Shartse Geshe in the second row, Tutenjimba and myself. This is Genny Trimbell's masterwork, and one in which he goes to India in 1934, exactly 700 years after Chalo Tsawa went to Bodh Gaya, and wants to fill the Tibetan people in on what's happened in the past 700 years in India. It's his confrontation, I think, with Western scholarship in very interesting ways, but one in which he comes to question many things in the Tibetan tradition without, I think, ever losing his own faith. He doesn't find it corrupting, in other words. As we know, of course, he was Nyingma Trulku, an erstwhile Gelugpa Geshe, and one of the great scholars of the tradition. And my own argument would be that this particular text is the greatest work of Tibetan literature of the 20th century. However, it wasn't translated for 25 years. Published in 1990, only translated this past year. And I was wondering about the reason for that. Of course, it's long, it's 600 pages, it's hard in many ways. But I think it wasn't translated for a different reason. And that reason is really found in a little poem that Genny Trimbell includes in this work. And it goes like this. Tori tarwe ngurgyu mijeshin. Sertang mulki tugo myongwe. Parma toru nebe nedida. Gungi porgyang. Kower shiptuje. So, of course, we all know Tibetan. I don't need to translate that. But because of my American accent, I should probably do that. As Genny Trimbell said after he met Rahul Sankrit Yayan, I met an Indian Pandita today. He had a lot of money and spoke Tibetan like a 7-year-old child. And since we're talking about translation, then let me translate those 4 lines. So, not serving as a cause of heaven or liberation, not becoming a door for the collection of gold and silver. Those things, ne, kao natane, those essential things, those important things, which abide in the in-between. Parma toru. Bungi porgyang, discarded by all. Kower shiptuche, I have analyzed in detail. So, Genny Trimbell then is horrified at the fact that Tibetans believe that when you find a Sanskrit manuscript, a precious work of Dharmakirti, for example, that you rip it up and eat it as a blessing. He mocks the Tibetan chronicles, which say that Gaya is a 5-month journey from Bodh Gaya. And he even has the temerity to question Tarnata himself. As we learned, I did not know this, Tarnata claimed that he had a simultaneous incarnation with the Mughal Emperor Jahangir. Genen Turnbull writes the most extensive history of Islam ever produced in Tibetan up to that point. And he learned that when Jahangir got drunk, he liked to have his soldiers capture people that he would then skin alive. So Genen Turnbull says that perhaps Tarnata should have chosen Akbar instead of Jahangir as his simultaneous incarnation. But then he adds, who am I to question an omniscient Buddha? So we know that Genen Turnbull and others throughout the tradition questioned omniscient Buddhas, and that there are lessons that come from within the tradition itself. And so I guess my own reading of that of those 4 lines would be that after over 100 years, almost 200 years now of the academic study of Buddhism, when it comes to Indian Buddhism, we pretty much understand well the Tori, Tarwe, Ngurgyu, right? The direct causes of heaven and liberation. Maybe the Gyugyu we still don't know too well, but the Ngurgyu, I think we're in good shape. Also, we're at this fantastic moment in our history. As Dan Martin was referring yesterday to the question, the other transaction, in which Ngultang Ser are being gathered for the purpose of translation. This is fantastic. And those things having been gathered, I guess my appeal would be for us to recognize that this tradition that we study is perhaps the most bibliophilic or bibliomaniacal tradition in human history, perhaps the most scriptophilic, the most scriptomaniacal tradition in history, and that we have the opportunity to read what great lamas thought every day. That is, we can reconstruct through their works the intimate details of their lives, allowing us to write microhistories of this tradition. And whatever else these people were, they were also human. And whatever timeless truths they may have discovered, those truths were discovered in time. And therefore, by looking at those things, those ne that abide in the in-between, I think we're able to have a much richer understanding of this tradition that we've devoted our lives to study. Is that 5 minutes?
Yeah, you have some more time. Do you want to close your...
Yeah, so the question then is to my fellow panelists who have read widely in the tradition, what resources have you found that help us to approach this question of authenticity and myth? And I guess what I was trying to imply in my final comment is that, in a certain sense, all Tibetan texts are authentic. We don't have to divide between those which you need a lung and those that you don't. There's great value in all of them.
Thank you.
One thing that struck me as I was reading your book is that I haven't finished it all, but I read most of it, was that although Gendon Chopal had sort of broken free into a sort of intellectual freedom that, and was not afraid to go and find out for himself, there was something you said in one of the the letters you when we were preparing for this talk. You said that there was some way he's not quite a modern scholar. He's not sort of somewhere in between. And actually, he reminded me very much of a medieval scholar. I've often had this feeling when receiving teachings from a Kempo, for instance, and the whole way that it's presented and the whole kind of Tibetan scholasticism is presented, that it was very similar to the outlook in 13th century Paris. the Aquinas. And so, I mean, you know what I mean. And one of the things that amused me very much was when Genpo Chöpel talks about Sanskrit, and he says it's not credible that this language was ever naturally spoken. No mother ever taught her child Sanskrit. It's far too complicated. It's an invention of, and it's exactly what Dante says about Latin. He says exactly the same thing about Latin in medieval Europe. And he says it, of course, because he believes that all languages that exist really go back to the Tower of Babel, unchanged. So I wanted to ask you, did Genpo Chöpel have this idea of language that they were kind of static and unchanging?
Oh no, he understood language change quite well, I think, yeah.
So what was his... Because Dante regarded Latin as a kind of corrective to the chaos after Babel that had been invented by sages. So what was the reason for the invention of Sanskrit in his view?
I don't think he talks about that. He's really...
No, I don't think so. But do you have any idea?
Why Sanskrit was invented?
No, why he thought that he thought it was. Or was it just that it was just incredible, just impossible to believe that it had been...
Well, he felt that languages like Sanskrit were the inventions of scholars, that they were not naturally spoken language, I think is historically accurate. He was also quite interested in Tibetan language reform, which Geshe-la has also written about himself, so it's kind of a different topic. Yeah. I guess, one of the things with the study of Genpo Chöpel that one wants to try to avoid is to see him as the embodiment of everything, right? The first this, right? The first modernist, the first sexologist, the first person to question the tradition. Of course, that's false, and so I'm really hoping that you can think of somebody else. Please.
But the thing you just said about his regarding Sanskrit as, something somebody made up.
Constructed, which is that's what Sanskrit means.
I mean, I can't help but come back to the question we began with, Wulstan, about then the authenticity of what did he think that the Buddha taught these things in Sanskrit? Does that then mean that he regarded those scriptures as obviously not authentic documents because it was such a made-up scholar's language?
No, I think he certainly accepted that the Buddha taught the sutras, but I think he was very influenced by the Pali scholarship of the day, which would have seen Pali as kind of the lingua franca of the period, which is false, but that was sort of what was going on. So.
Yeah.
Just because a language is a literary construction doesn't mean that it's false too, right? I mean, it could very well have been created for a purpose based on a very valid spoken vernacular for a particular purpose. And written Tibetan was also, in a sense, constructed in the same way. And our translations today, we're also in the process of constructing a language to convey ideas that are not indigenous in our cultures. So there's a kind of parallel.
Yeah. And he learned Sanskrit quite well and was extremely proud and even arrogant about that, and how bad the Sanskrit of other Tibetans was compared to him. One other story was right when they came out in 1934, they stopped in, they gathered a lot of Sanskrit manuscripts, especially of Dharmakirti, and stopped in Kathmandu to show them to Hemachandra, who was the Purohita of the Nepalese king. And so Rajasankar and Hemachandra had the Sanskrit fragment there, and Genpo Chöpel was actually reading aloud from the Tibetan so they could see which parts were left out. And they did that for several hours. And then later, Rajasankar said to Genpo Chöpel that after they left, Hemachandra said to Rahul, "If your Tibetan servant knows Dharmakirti that well, I'd like to meet a real Tibetan scholar." Any? So, it's gone to Jules.
Oh, sure. Jules, would you like to? Thank you for your discussion. We continue with questions later as well. Jules, would you like to introduce your topic and your question for us?
I'm ceding my time to him because I need a lot.
I guess the question I've been wrestling with from the time that I was invited to take part in this panel is well, as I phrased it to my colleagues, in this translation and transmission, where exactly does a translator stand? And what, if anything, does authenticity have to do with it? But I mean, I just pulled that out of the air at a certain crucial moment, and I'm not sure if it's where I am at this morning. By which I mean that from the moment I was invited to sit here, I've just been mulling over a lot of big ideas that I'm not sure I understand very well. Thinking about the nature of hierarchical thinking and the culture of a democracy and the perils of colonizing and of being colonized and the possibilities of a new Orientalism and all sorts of other things that, as I say, sort of intimidate me even to mention. And then just a few days ago, as if I'd like to think as the fruit of having thought about such things, but in any case, more or less whole, something came to me. And if you don't mind, I'd just like to read it. It's not very long, because I think it's the way I can say it best. And then there's, if I have time, 3 little stories I'd like to tell. We'll see. So, with your permission, for some, the mission of the translator will be to propagate the doctrine or the religion. And for others, the mission of the scholar, who may also be a translator, will be to sort out the various forces that have determined, enlarged, obscured, diverted, or in some other manner affected the long history of writing, speaking, and in various other ways conveying, perhaps transmitting, the Buddha Dharma in its Asian and now also its global settings. But this morning I'd like to talk for just a moment about something else that translators can do. What interests me right now, I think because I can imagine it moving in secret and palpable ways into the language and life of the only people whose future I can hope to wonder over in anything remotely approaching a realistic manner, seems ever more to be the task of adding something new to the great river of American literature, songs in an authentically American key. In brief, I think one role the translator can play is to provide fertile soil from which a new American literature can grow, in somewhat the way that Tibetan translators gave Tibet the ground from which astonishing poetry and exposition grew. Now, if there's anything to that notion, then rather than think of myself and my colleagues as missionaries or teachers or transmitters of anything in particular, I think of us as early voices in what will over time develop into the poetry, the storytelling, the reflective contemplation, the visionary exploration of lands somewhere just beyond the next mountain, somewhere over the distant horizon, of those who will come after us and who will live in and enjoy a culture, an entire civilization really, that has been more than just tangentially or superficially touched by the profundity, the sweep, the magnificence, the powerful beauty of Buddhist inquiry into, pursuit of, and evocation of the sacred. Now that may seem far-fetched, but when one considers the impact that the stories gathered into the Hebrew Bible the stories that compose the Christian New Testament, the stories that somebody, probably many somebodies, wove into the Iliad and the Odyssey, the stories that make up the Mahabharata and the Ramayana, the stories that Zhang Nyunherika shaped into his alarming, instructive, and inspiring accounts of the lives of Telo, Naro, Marpa, and Neljorgi Wangchuk Mila Shepa Dorje Jetsun Milarepa. When one thinks of the force these stories have exerted upon the lives of people who have heard them, studied them, sung them, retold them for many generations, maybe what I'm saying does not seem entirely foolish. After all, stories may well be what make us human, and I think we should tell them again and again, in new ways, new forms, new languages, and to new audiences. At this moment, the task seems to be finding a way to make them say something to the people of our own time and the time to come, which must be the transmission part of this. Now, by story, of course, I mean, in the largest terms, any stream of meaning and image and idea flowing from one point to another, whether it's a poem or a novel or an argument or even, I suppose, a mathematical equation. But when I myself, as best I can, work my way through the fourfold reversal of one's mind from its natural enthusiasm for the cycle of birth and death, or the 7 ways of transforming one's attitude toward that of a bodhisattva, or the evolution of 2 truths across 4 schools of tenets, and on and on and on. I mean, I hear stories there. I hear stories, the outlines of stories and actual stories, and stories begging to be told in many different ways. And I think we have ample models of that in the past, of abstruse ideas becoming compelling narratives. So I think if we're standing in between one thing and another, which seems to be where translators stand, we're standing in between this wealth of literature and the stories that we may tell in the future. I don't know how much of my time I just used up. Well, then, at the risk of telling a story that isn't true because my memory may be bad, it is bad. But I remember, or at least think I remember, something that His Holiness the Dalai Lama said when he came to Charlottesville in 1979 that left a tremendous impact on me, at least, perhaps others, if indeed he did say this. So there are people in the room who were there, and I hope I've got it right. But I remember his saying that for us, and I took him to mean Tibetan Buddhists, the Buddhist teachings in Tibetan culture are one and the same thing. And that for us it's not possible to tell the difference between them, even though, as he said, I know there's a difference, but I'm not sure I know what it is. And you will have to figure out what it is. And I was flabbergasted, of course, and overwhelmed and intimidated. And over the years since then, I've thought, well, then, if we take that a little further, what about the Buddhist teachings in Indian culture? What about the Buddhist teachings in, if you will, Buddhist culture? Not that I'm suggesting that we need to strip it down and get rid of everything else, but it might be a good idea to know who's who. So if that's what's coming at us as we stand in between, then I was thinking about sort of, well, who are we talking into? and I could invoke all these big ideas that I mentioned a moment ago that I feel so small beside, but just a silly vignette. A friend of mine who's probably here this morning wrote me a note the other day, and this is a guy who's, you know, of Eastern European descent, like me, who is now living in Canada, translating Buddhist texts from Tibetan into English that are then disseminated into many other languages. And he begins his note to me saying, "Aloha, amigo." And ends it saying, "Ciao, sarvamangalam." So I'm thinking that kind of encapsulates where we are at this point, in between one complexity and another complexity, and not quite sure how to navigate the relationship between the two. Now, the last thing, and then I'll stop, you'll be delighted to know, is about termites. And this is just something I heard on the radio 6 months ago or so. And it stuck with me as how we might go about things, maybe how we are going about things. And I apologize for comparing a community of translators to a swarm of termites, but because I'm not, it's just an interesting thing. And it just starts by pointing out that termites work together to build intricate, large-scale structures. They do things by pushing little bits of mud around. And they're not following a blueprint, and there's no termite foreman who's telling them what to do. Instead, they sense what's around them, and they apply some very simple rules and do one thing, and then another one does another thing. And so it goes on to talk about how some scientists are building robots, little robots, you know, a few inches long, to try to do similar things, like build dams or build space stations or build this, that, or the other. And one of them says about the robots, he says, rather than talk to one another directly, they coordinate indirectly by changing their shared environment. So one puts down some material, and another one comes along and reacts to that material, and uses that to help it decide later whether or not to put more material down, where, how. And in the end, somehow, as he says, they manage to construct something much larger than themselves. So I'm sure you see right through this transparent idea, and I hope you'll take the better parts of it, if there are any. But one of the things that struck me is that the termites don't go about tearing each other's work down. Instead of taking things away, they respond to what's there, and they just add something else. And in adding something else, they reshape the environment. So I took a very, cheerful message from that.
Would you like to pose a question to the panel along the lines of termites or other?
Well, I mean, I think there's two things I think I just said, and I wonder about both of them. And one is, there are a lot of Europeans and people from all parts of the world here. All I was mentioning was American literature because it's all I can think about, but I would just assume it applies everywhere else as well. What do you think of this notion of not just how we focus on the things that are most in front of us, most germane to our own discipline, but our effect on the larger cultures around us and the great streams of literature around us? And just this whole notion of being in the middle. We're in between. I mean, talk about Pardo. We are in between this and that, and, often everybody's mad at us on all sides of the conversation. So, if anything there that you'd like to pick up on, I'd be delighted to learn something from you.
I respond quite. I enjoyed that last allegory about the termite. When it comes to translation, I'm just usually, as I said in the workshop yesterday, I'm completely amazed that you love it all so much. And you're all so happy to be translators, and it's a great source of pleasure. I find it torture, usually. And I'm usually oppressed by the, at the end looking at it. I suppose it's a bit like the depression you might have when you've had a baby. You look at it and I'm just oppressed by its imperfections and the fact that it's so awful. And so I really don't think we should ever criticize others, because it's really important to encourage each other.
Any final thoughts on that topic before we move to questions from the audience?
Well, it might be good to think about more efforts at collaboration. This conference is such a wonderful occasion that brings us together to share our perspectives and we haven't gotten down to some of the really basic, techniques, and there's so much more to say. And I think by sharing collaboratively, we can bring to bear some of the methods that American culture has to give about groups working together. And for those who are interested, those who wish to work in isolation, I respect that as well. But I think many of us feel that we could gain a great deal by more conversations of this kind. So bringing us together so we can figure out how to move next could be really good.
I would just add to sort of second Jules' point about the termites and about our work. As scholars, as sophists in the academy, translation has typically not been valued in our process of tenure and promotion. That's changing a little bit, but it's really the case that you really should only start doing translations after you get tenure. Because what's important up to that point is your own ideas, that is, as they would appear in a monograph. And I've come to think myself, I've had tenure for a long time now, that my own ideas, as interesting as they may be to me, are nonetheless works of a particular historical moment, and they have a contribution to make, but it's my perspective and my thought which I'm presenting to others. If I translate something, I'm offering people an opportunity to think their own thoughts, to provide them with a text that will be a source for their own imagination rather than presenting them with my own. And so I think that sort of fits in with Jules's theme of looking, laughing, holding hands, the two embracing. The four tantras abide in the nature of bugs. We had to memorize that in UVA back in the 70s.
Excellent. Well, that's a nice place to end. So thank you so much for your So I'll take some questions from the audience. Can begin with Tyler, please.
Panelists, for each of your wonderful, wonderful presentations. Very, very inspiring. I'd like to just ask what you think of these two examples that I want to share about how I deal with responding to outdated or misogynistic references to women. So one example is in a book that I translated. There was a and as we know, the second chapter is about discipline. It's not the main topic of the book. And you got the sense that he was just kind of going through the pro forma kind of references while he was leading up to the main topic. And in doing so, the author said, by practicing pure discipline, the bodhisattva avoids rebirth as beings born from moisture, beings born from eggs, beings born from blah, blah, blah. And hermaphrodites and women. And so what I did in that instance is I just kind of lied and I took one for the team. And I just pretended that he didn't even say that. So I didn't put that in English at all. Nor did I put any footnote, because what's the use of putting a footnote by saying, oh, and by the way, he really said women sucks, but I didn't want to put that in the main text. So I chose not to even put it as a footnote. And it's intellectual dishonesty in the sense that it doesn't provoke a perhaps somewhat necessary analysis of why would the author say that, and it doesn't in a sense expose the author to worthy criticism, but at the same time, I felt it's more beneficial to not serve as a distraction from the main work of the book. And I was doing that on faith that the author was just knocking out some pro forma statements while getting on to the main topic, which was investigating the prajna of emptiness. So that's just the one decision that I took at that time. I'd love to hear your thoughts. The other one is that on a book I'm going to finishing the translation of currently, and that's that the text says, by practicing pure discipline, by practicing refraining from sexual misconduct, bodhisattvas are reborn in a pure realm where there's no women. And then, so in this case, I'm going to use brackets and adaptation, and I'm going to say something like, bodhisattvas are born in a pure realm where, something like they're not triggered by or where there are no objects to trigger neurotic sexual desire, and and I'm doing that because, and then I'm going to footnote what I'm doing, be a little bit intellectually more honest than I was in the previous case, and I'm going to say, in order to comport with modern sensibilities toward gender and sexual identity, this passage employs adaptation as opposed to translation. So kind of just politely hinting that some nasty stuff was said in the original. I'd love to hear your thoughts on those two options that I chose.
I think the first one, you can't leave something out of the text. I mean, it was in the Lung, so you have to translate that. I mean, it's on whose authority do you decide to leave something out of the text? We've had so much deference to authority and transmission over the last couple of days. If there's something in the text that you don't like, you just leave it out. That's stepping onto a slippery slope. And at what point you can then leave out whatever you want to because it doesn't fit, whatever that means. So I would actually argue in favor of translating the words that are on the page and then dealing with what they say in whatever manner, but not leaving anything out.
Yeah, I think I would probably do what Don has just said, and there's another side to it, and I hope not to gesture too much at the darkness, but I'm a little concerned about pretending to people that things are better than they are. You know? And I was very moved last night as Jeffrey Hopkins was talking about when you see how lousy things are, then you actually notice something magnificent. So maybe the stronger reasons are the one where Don just said, on whose authority? I mean, I have no answer to that whatsoever as to how to leave it out. And I personally rather just, as he said, put it there and deal with it, address it, But it's really painful, I mean, for myself, for instance, okay, just to make it really painful for myself. Suppose instead of women it said Jews, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah. And then I really get it. But I think, okay, face it, don't pretend they didn't say it. I don't know. It's hard.
Well, I agree with my esteemed colleagues, and I think that there is time. I mean, when we, in all intellectual honesty, just simply have to translate out. But we also have to call people out on racist, sexist, homophobic comments, and then we can explain our choices. So I think that what your second example is a good middle way.
I think I am also saying something just on the same topic. Few years ago, some of us was asked to come and translate the the prayer book of Kajumalam by Karmapa in Dharamsala. And then I went there and I said, there are prayers saying that may we not be born as a woman, or may all women become men. So how shall we translate it? Because if we say that, then not only that all these English-speaking women will not want to pray like that, but that they will run away and they will not actually participate in that prayer. And the first he said, what can we do? It's in the text, There's nothing we can do. It's in the text. Then he said, okay, I'll just think about it. So next morning he came and he said, well, last night I was thinking about it and then I went to sleep. And next morning I woke up and then I opened a book that was on my table, Pesha. The first thing that was written there was that Purusha means power. Purusha in Sanskrit means power. So he said, what's the main problem is that the women feel that they don't have any power. That was the main reason why they were praying not to be born as a woman or to be born as men. So let us say that, all the women get power, or that all the women become men, become powerful. So we translate it like that. And it's in the text like that. So from that onwards, we thought that we would do something like that, because that's the main reason why in the Indian society, as well as any society, where women, were praying to be men or not pray, because of this, society problems that women are treated very bad. That's the main reason.
So you're saying that you actually corrected the text for the greater good?
Yeah.
Consciously, okay.
So translated the Tibetan word differently.
Differently,
right?
not as
right.
woman, not as, because we wanted to go deeper into the reason why. Not delete it, but go a little bit deeper and then translate it in like that.
Just to go back to Tyler's question, I think you were referring to what David Bellos was talking about, the Belles Infidèles, where you correct your text according to the current canons of politeness in society. But I think actually we also adopted the same trick in to deal with there's a passage in the dedication chapter of the Bodhicharyavatara where Shantideva says, "May all the women in the world become men by the merit of this thing." And so we translated it, "May all the women in the world attain the strength of masculinity." And then, of course, that is a bowdlerization. Meaning, may they have the same advantages and the same. Maybe you don't like masculinity, but it scanned well. But since it was a bowdlerization, there is an endnote saying what Shantideva said was, "May all the women in the world become men," but he can't possibly have meant this literally because it involves the extinction of the human race.
So what do we do when beings who are considered spiritually enlightened express these unenlightened political and social perspectives or attitudes? I mean, this is another way to deal with it. So I might revise my earlier opinion and say that, as Jeffrey has said for decades, that there are more than one style of translation, and people have to make their own choices in how they deal with these issues, and that's another possible way.
Depending on the people you're doing the translation for, actually.
Well, that raises a whole other can of worms.
Yeah, I know.
And whether our choices are dictated by the sponsors.
the sponsors. Already.
Economic disparities
see.
is
Well,
something
they
we
won't
haven't
buy the
really
books, yeah.
treated. Mhm.
Yeah.
So, I mean, are we simply functionaries, or that's part of the also authenticity issue, I suppose, and agency question.
Yeah, I mean, in the workshop yesterday, somebody raised the point that when you're translating something as a student in the faculty, you have to be very literal. Otherwise, your moderator will say, "I want to make sure that you understand what the text means," and therefore it will be very literal. But if you're translating something that is going to be read by people who will never have access to the original language, you want to convey the meaning in a way that they will get it easily. And so if you're translating for the community of practitioners, there's no point in alienating. I mean, actually, at least in Dordogne, the large majority of people who practice are women. So it makes absolutely no sense to say something that will alienate them in a way, if you can avoid it. And you can avoid it by inviting them to reflect on the text in a different way. But I agree with Don. You can't you have to put what the text says somehow or other.
I know that we're in a queuing country. We respect that and all that. But I was just wondering, before we shift to another topic, were there other people in line who wanted to comment on this particular topic before we move on? Janet?
I think all of us
have something related. Okay.
I have something.
Please.
I wanted to return to the issue, or rather the exchange between Wulstan and Donald that began the session. It sort of revolved around the issue of Buddhavacana or Sangigika. And I think that we would all, whether practitioner or scholar, acknowledge that traditionally Tibetans have been historiographically naive. Nevertheless, Dr. Lopez, and I don't, with all due respect, I don't mean this as a personal attack. You characterized the whole issue of Sangigika within the Tibetan tradition as a defense, and I'm not sure if that's actually that. My inclination is
Indian tradition I was talking about.
the Indian tradition. Okay, thank you. My inclination is that might be missing. There might be some cultural misunderstanding here. George Dreyfus, in his book The Sound of Two Hands Clapping, writes very persuasively about how the Tibetan tradition masks innovation through tradition by presenting it as something new. Those of us, all of us probably know how, in some sense, saying that something is one's own creation, it basically damns it as to be inauthentic.
Rangso.
Rangso, exactly. So the Tibetan tradition, because of the values that are developed within that tradition, have developed alternative techniques to accommodate for innovation. And I think I would just wanted to ask you, whether, all of you, in fact, if whether the issue of what constitutes Sangigika, Buddhavacana, is actually a much deeper issue than a matter of, is it Pali, is it Magadhi, is it Sanskrit? Because in some sense, as I understand it, and I may well be wrong, that the speech of the Buddha comes from his insight. And the Buddha didn't claim to be the first one to have that insight. In fact, he spoke of many Buddhas being the seventh Buddha of this era and so forth. So in some sense, the Buddha is rediscovering something that others have discovered before. And it is that insight which gives his speech authority. While I have great respect for historiography, it's one of my own personal interests, and I think that is something moving forward that we should certainly not neglect. Nevertheless, in that discussion, I think we would be well served to mine the deeper, the other considerations, such as the one that George Dreyfus brings up in Two Hands Clapping, and this whole notion of what is authority. And I think where does that authority come from? Does it come from the scripture? Wulstan said one of the things that appealed to him about Buddhism was that it was not a religion of the book, that authority comes from the inside of the Buddha. And as the late, great Dungse Tenle Norbu said, it's wisdom mind, really, that it comes down to. So anyway, I apologize. I've probably gone on too long, but I think that this issue bears a lot on the notion of transmission or going forward. I think there is possibly some ground for academics and scholars to meet, so long as we can appreciate that the philosophical sophistication of understanding what exactly we mean by Buddha Vajana.
Thank you. Comments?
Of course, this issue of innovation is throughout the entire Buddhist tradition, right? I mean, the problem is that or the wonder is that the Buddha understood everything in the universe that night on his birthday, and nothing has been discovered since then that he did not know at that point, and therefore anything that is new in the tradition must trace itself back to that night, that moment that we can never recapture in a certain sense. And so that's not anything particularly Tibetan, obviously. I guess I would sort of disagree on the question of whether Buddhism is a religion of the book or not, but that's a whole other conversation, probably another panel, so maybe we'll stop there.
I just want to mention again, we have very limited time and a lot of people would like to speak, so please try to be concise in your statements.
Okay, so I actually am following up on the same topic, and I told myself I wasn't going to be at this microphone this week, and I promised myself I wouldn't do this, but this is like my doorknob confession, I guess. I see I'm not alone because there's a huge line behind me and over there. So about this issue of history and myth and Buddha Vajana, and did the Buddha teach, the Mahayana Sutras and the Tantras or not? Peter and I actually talked about this a couple months ago, and I was reflecting on the fact that the 84,000 translation project is actually going to make materials available to people that will contradict the idea that the Buddha taught all of these sutras, because all of those, that's just one strain of mythology in the tradition. There are many different voices, and the large majority of Mahayana sutras are put in the mouths of others, right? The Buddha just sits there. I personally think that that's the tradition saying, yeah, we know the Buddha didn't teach this. And then also there's been plenty of scholarship on the fact that, in Taranatha says that the Tantras were not taught during the time of the Buddha. They were a revelation, and they started 50 years after he died, right? But still we find ourselves in this sort of like manufactured crisis of, well, we have to say the Buddha taught everything, but it doesn't jive with what we know historically. But this is when you find that you have a lot of friends in history in the tradition as well. And the tradition itself, if you actually read the texts, is very explicit about the fact that the Buddha the words did not come out of his mouth.
Let's try to keep the comments
so how do we,
flowing a little faster.
Yeah, okay. So then how do we deal with integrating those mythologies and introducing sanghas to the fact that there may be less of a crisis here? It may be manufactured from the side of the sangha. That's my question.
Well, I go back to that thing of Mary Midgley where she says, it's all right for our imagination shapes the world, our worldview. We have to be aware of the way it does it, and that the myths that we construct are not completely non-negotiable. And it's like saying when you speak, it's like one is made uncomfortable by the fact that maybe the Buddha didn't actually say this, or there are all sorts of unpleasant things that one finds. But the teachings are so vast that they're much bigger than any individual ever needs to attain accomplishment. You can just ignore it, surely. It doesn't. Why is it? You don't have to say I believe everything, or I don't know. That's my take on it.
This is much along the lines of...
Hold on 1 second. Let me just interrupt and say that there's a very large line on both sides. So perhaps what we could do is each of you could give a brief statement, and then the panel could respond all at once, because we're going to run out of time. We can go a little bit into the tea break, but I think it's really going to be difficult to get through all of the great translators and scholars here. So,
along the lines of the last few questions and comments, I'd like to make a distinction between what we know that we don't know and what we know is not the case. And so when we deploy a certain kind of logical framework to back up one set of conclusions, then it sort of undermines itself. So the question becomes, what is Buddha word? Where do we find the criteria to assess that? Again, the same question comes with the tear. We could do a thought experiment and put a group of geshes and khenpos in a monastery in India, and they would have a lot of tools to assess modern science and come to conclusions about it. But in the end, they don't have the technology or the direct knowledge to come to final conclusions about a great number of things. And so I think if we are looking for some kind of set of criteria or a valid process to assess what is really Buddha word right now, we have to be self-conscious about that, and we have to ask, do we find it in the academy? Do we find it in modernity? Do we find it in the ancient tradition? Do we find it in the in-between spaces? And leave that for the whole room.
Willa, please.
Thank you to all the panelists, but this is kind of a question directed at Karma Lekshe. At one point I asked one of my teachers in the Kagyu lineage about the refuge tree, and I asked him, he's a High Rinpoche, if he would ever consider having the refuge tree repainted so that the images of women could be equal in number to the images of men, even though we don't have them specifically in the lineage. And his answer was, I can't change history. And I left that meeting disappointed, actually, and sad about that answer, just because images speak to women on a very powerful level, more powerful than language. If you're prostrating to an image, that image is getting into your limbic system and is giving you messages. So I'm just wondering if you have an answer to that.
I just have a few things I'll try to say very briefly. One is just to thank you for a really, really excellent panel. I'm really so happy that it turned out the way that it did. On the issue of just the really larger issue of academia and practitioners, I think the panel demonstrates the great contribution that each have to make to each other, and I really hope that we try to avoid that bifurcation as much as possible. It's not to say that there's not problems with lots of academic scholarship. There's also problems with lots of practitioner scholarship, which is not, sufficiently informed in certain kinds of ways, but also to avoid the dichotomy between what the mind knows and what the heart knows. I don't think that that's what academia is engaged in doing either, and I think what our task is, especially now, is never to let down our critical minds, and our task is really to bring together what the heart knows and what the mind knows and figure out how to do that well. Just a couple, and I think what was so beautiful about the panel is Karma Lekshe Tsomo's issue really draws our attention precisely to this issue, because it is the case that it is modern critical thinking that has brought up the entire feminist issue. And it's thanks to the multiple kind of perspectives on Buddhism that we're able to recognize these problems. And on the question of how to translate, I do think it's very, very important for us to remember and know what the history is, precisely because it keeps us on the edge, and it keeps us recognizing, yes, Buddhism does have to evolve, and also allows us to take the wonderful riches that we get from Buddhism, but also to keep our critical minds at work. I just want to say, so one possible solution about the translation issue is when you're translating a text, to try to translate it exactly in terms of what it says. All these other devices that Karma Lekshe Tsomo brought up, I think, are valid, But in the case of liturgies or practices that sadhanas, for example, that people are doing, that's a moment, perhaps very self-consciously, and have it be well known, we're changing this for these particular reasons. I just want to add two more very brief points. One of them is that on the question of modernity and also the question of critical thinking and innovation in Tibetan history, there really is a lot more there than we have recognized, precisely because of our kind of desire to see the Tibetans as having a completely different worldview than we do. I just finished a big study on Tibetan medicine, which is precisely to look at the role of innovation and modernist thinking way before the word modernity was ever invented. And so I think that the more that we look at it, we're going to see that the Tibetan Buddhist tradition is very, very aware of these historical problems. Perhaps the term defense is not maybe the best word, but they're very well aware of the historical problems of some of the claims and then coming up with ways to deal with that. And my final very brief point is that I don't, as a woman, I don't really want masculine power. I would much prefer... My last sentence, I much prefer female power.
Thank you, Janet.
My question is actually a pre-translation question, which I finally worked up the nerve to ask at the last panel. But I would like to know how you prepare yourselves before you actually begin a translation, mentally, physically, in your mind, because I may have a very gender-neutral idea that I'm just so excited that I have the opportunity to finally learn something from a text. But before I start, I find my own cultural background of being raised as from a very traditional Chinese family, all of the gender issues of being a woman coming before me and holding me back from even starting off.
Thank you.
Oh, yeah, I just want to speak up for the termites. I really am thankful to Jules for bringing up the termites, because to me it resolved the distortion, I think, of the practitioner and the academic that we received bravely and nicely in an interesting way. The academic knowing certain facts for sure that they think they know, and the practitioner having a perfection in front of them. And it made me think of Bimalakirti in the latter part of that sutra. I'm sorry to always hark back to that, but it has a hold of me. When Bimalakirti meets Shakyamuni and brings his assembly over to meet Shakyamuni, and Shakyamuni asks him, well, now you wanted to come and see the Buddha, now you see the Buddha, what do you see? And Bimalakirti says, when I see a particular body before me, I don't see a Buddha. When I see a text, I don't see a Buddha. And he completely demolishes any idea that Buddha is anything other than the Dharmakaya, which is everything, actually. And he's talking right to the Buddha. And yet on a conventional perspectival level, he is talking to the Buddha. And so what I wanted to say is that the termite that maybe gets trampled in the making of the termite hill is the one who doesn't just leave their material and allow others to come and put stuff on it, but guards their material. Mine is perfect, you know. So I see us as victims of perfection. And, you know, perfection, but is it really perfection on either side? The practitioner sees something, key point is, it's not that it's perfection, unless they need to think of it as that. It's something higher than themselves, so that they can better themselves. And the good academic, and not the one trapped in dogma of thinking that academia, like the current American academia, thinks it knows everything and defends itself and has to prove that everybody else doesn't know everything. And so therefore facts, you know, it forgets that the Latin word fact comes from the verb facio, to make. So it's something made. There is no objective fact. So nobody knows whether the Buddha taught Mahayana or doesn't teach Mahayana. Nobody knows that. They do not know that. That's a pretense that they know, that we know the history of India. That's a pretense. We don't know that. It's a bunch of speculations that we have laid forth. So we do it. It's good to have it and good to see it, but also to be open to constant self-betterment, self-revision, getting out of the trap of perfection, transcending the trap of perfection, and being a good termite, and putting your load there and not trying to pretend it's the perfect load. And of course, Buddhist hermeneutics supports you in that the only ultimate reality is achieved by negation, by opening the way. And all theories and facts are perspectival, relational, illusory, and will dissolve under analysis. And that's how we live like good termites. Thank you for the termites.
All right. So
let's hear it for Viva la termites.
Thank you so much. So we're over time. Maybe we could take a few extra minutes for the panel to respond and say a few last things. I'm sorry, but I think we're just going on a little too long. So if you could just respond, and we'll.
We don't get to go, is that it?
Yeah.
So let them. Yeah,
let them go. Right? We've said a lot.
Yeah.
All right.
Please.
Hi.
Democracy.
I have a quick resource announcement for the translators. It's a great resource because I also do both oral and written translations. And Trace Foundation has been doing a lot of translation of lately the Gindun Chimpe's proceedings. We supported a conference on Gindun Chimpe in 2003. The proceedings are now available both in English and Tibetan. And one more great news, Luke Shatler, who did the film on Gindun Chimpe, the Angry Monk, and he donated the entire transcript of the over 40 interviews of the direct Gindun Chimpe's disciples. And the good news for the translators is some of these interviews talks about the challenges that the Gindun Chimpe faced when he translated from Sanskrit to Tibetan. Just one example. For example, in one of the interviews, Gindun Chimpe mentioned that he had a trouble translating mango in Tibetan because they just say mango is and nobody talks about what tastes like. Then he said the mango tastes like yogurt with honey. And then the Tibetans really start talking about where can I get in evening. And so these are coming up in Trace Foundation's website in 2 weeks, and they're bilingual. And I think for translators, it's really interesting to read both sides. So just I thought maybe it would be interesting.
Thank you.
Venerable Karma Lekshe Tsomo, thank you for raising the social justice issues, which you did, which are very close to my heart. I don't think it's beyond the ability of the people assembled in this room to create gorgeous, terse, effective, inclusive language. We just have to want that. And so I'd like to just make the suggestion that there be maybe a session or a day or a conference where we just get together and do it, because individual translators are already trying. If we can handle how, find guidelines in the 84,000 guidelines, how to transliterate Tibetan names, we can do this. It's a little harder, but maybe not too much harder. Luckily, our Christian counterparts have been struggling with these issues for a long time. Phyllis Tribble, her book Texts of Terror, grappling with the dismemberment, rape, disparagement of women in the Bible. They've been doing this. They can help us if we go to them. So I want to just suggest that. And then I also just want to, it's a really great opportunity for me to pose a question which gnaws at my heart. And if you answer it, I'll be so happy, which is, how can a tradition which enshrines these attitudes towards women, embedded in cultures which are as misogynistic as our own or any have ever been, how could this tradition have ever created any enlightened masters? Please tell me. I know you've asked yourself. That's all.
Okay, last word. Very quick, I promise. On the matter of whether the Mahayana Sutras and the Tantras are the word of the Buddha or not. Now, if you take these sutras and Tantras, which are deemed not to be the word of the Buddha, when they are studied, such as in the Abhisama Alankara studies the sutras, and the Tantras are studied, they can be seen to lead to some kind of state which we call enlightenment. They can be understood as leading to that state. Now, the question is that state of enlightenment equal to the state attained by Buddha Shakyamuni? If it is not, if Buddha Shakyamuni's state of enlightenment is inferior to the one attained through the Tantras, then we may as well just kick out Buddha Shakyamuni and follow Nagarjuna. And His Holiness Dalai Lama has said something like this. If we see, and it would be ridiculous to do that, if on the other hand we say that the state of enlightenment that's been achieved by Buddha Shakyamuni is the same as the state of enlightenment that's achieved through practicing the non-Buddhist Tantras, then they are the word of the Buddha. No problem.
Thank you. So thank you for our very provocative and enriching discussion from our panelists and from our distinguished audience as well. Thank you so much.
Don't we get to say anything?
Oh, please.
Yeah.
Do we have time, Marcus?
Please do go.
Yeah? Okay.
I want to say that I agree absolutely with what Janet Gyatso said. There's actually a very interesting passage in the Yeshe Tsogyal Namtar where Guru Rinpoche says to Yeshe Tsogyal, when bodhicitta is present, the female form is superior. And actually, sometimes the Dalai Lama talks in this way, and it's the kind of thing we're beginning to hear now, that, when you look around, the hunters, the people working in the slaughterhouses, the soldiers, the torturers, and so on, they're nearly all men. When you look at the kind of work that women do, it's nurturing, it's caring, supportive, and so on. So as bodhisattvas, as aspiring bodhisattvas, maybe we should pray to be reborn as women.
Well, I agree that enlightened awareness cannot be gendered. I mean, the idea of consciousness or any kind of enlightened awareness having genitals is absolutely ridiculous. And I don't think we need to aspire to that. So I think that that enlightened awareness can manifest in infinite forms. And if ordinary beings may not be able to assess that until we get enlightened ourselves. I agree very much that feminist exegesis is very highly honed in the Christian tradition, and that we can learn from that, and that we should learn from that. And I hope that many of the younger scholars here will take that up. Feminist exegesis of Buddhist texts, starting from the beginning. And last, I'd like to say that in the lineage of contemporary translators, we do see women represented. However, as far as I know, we don't see any Tibetan women represented. So I would hope that in light of Annie's comments, that we would encourage and support and sort of maybe overcompensate for the lack of confidence that many women feel in terms of their potential. If we support and encourage them, then I think the future of translation and transmission is very bright.
Final comments? No? Jules? Anything to say? No?
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Beautiful.